My name is Lincoln Chen, and I was a research scientist at the Cholera Research Laboratory in Dhaka. I was assigned here from the U.S. National Institute of Health to study cholera. We arrived in July 1970, and that was after 2 years of my having completed a residency in the United States. And I was sent here to conduct research on cholera at the Cholera Center. Dhaka was a small provincial capital, about, I think at that time, perhaps 500,000 people, not much larger than that. And there were very few foreigners here. There were perhaps just a few dozen, actually, in the entire city at that point. We were here during the elections, and the overwhelming sentiment, I think, swung, of course, pro Sheikh Mujib and Awami League for asserting the Bangladeshi independence. There was quite a bit of social ferment in the city, rallies, and of course, when the elections results came, people were quite happy. But then I think as it became increasingly clear that there was a standoff between the electoral process and the power structures in West Pakistan, there began to be increasing fears and concerns about what might happen. Well, on 25th of March, a curfew was imposed, and we stayed in our house. So we didn't see very much, but obviously we could hear the gunfire. We could see at night some of the fires burning. So for several days, that was the way we witnessed what was happening, which was confined to the house, hearing the gunfire, and then seeing the fires at night. And it was only, I think the curfew was about 3 days. It might have been 4 days. And then the radio announced that they were lifting the sanctions against movement. And as soon as that happened, we got into our car and we began to drive. And I still remember driving from Mohakali and turning into the main road. And just as we turned, there were no other people or cars in the street. But one of these tanks, half-tracks, came up the road. And all of a sudden, all of the Pakistani soldiers pointed their machine guns at our car. And that was pretty scary because any one of them could have they had been on a killing rampage and they could have just pulled the trigger. But fortunately, they didn't pull the trigger. And as we got closer, they began to see that we were just simply a few foreigners. But it had already been announced that the curfew was over. In any case, from that, we went and visited various scenes of where the carnage had taken place. To be a witness, basically, we were really concerned about what happened. We went down to Dhaka University. We went to the faculty housing, and that's when we saw the blood, caked blood on the stairwell of apartments. And then when we spoke with people, we heard about how people were dragged out and killed. We went down to old Dhaka, and there's a Shankari Bazaar, the area where they do the conch shell work, and that had been completely destroyed. I think there's a Hindu area, and we heard from the inhabitants there that guns had been placed at both ends of the street, and then soldiers came down and firebombed, and so many of the buildings were gutted, and we saw charred bodies in the ruins. Then there was another Hindu village on the race course, and that also got razed, so it was completely destroyed. And I suspect that the inhabitants, we didn't actually physically go there, but the inhabitants there were also killed. So there was really quite a bit of, I would say, targeted genocide in the sense of the intellectuals, Bengali intellectuals, leaders. Certainly there was an anti-Hindu element to the killings. After the curfew, there were a group of intellectuals that we were all concerned about, some of whom were our friends, and we actually housed a few of them in our house as physical safety. I remember one of them was a fellow named Ali Aksad, who was a member of the CP, the Marxist Party, but they were a group that we put up in our house so that they wouldn't stay in their own house, because the Army was combing through a list of various kinds and killing people. I think most of them got out through various informal, mostly by walking and otherwise. But it was a very trying period because there clearly was an attempt to, as genocide, eradicate a class of Bengalis who represented any threat of leadership. There was a lot of tension about whether we would be able to stay or whether we had to leave, and I think there was, a decision eventually that we would be evacuated. I think there was quite a bit of negotiations between the U.S. government, the Pakistan government about our departure. The Pakistan government refused. I think the original plan was that the plane might fly to Bangkok, which is the closest evacuation point, but the Pakistan government insisted that we leave via Pakistan West Wing. And then the plane that came was not allowed to fly over India. So at night, we flew in a chartered plane to Sri Lanka and then into Karachi. I still remember very vividly the night that we were leaving. It was really frightening because we didn't really know what the Pakistan Army seemed to be going crazy. We didn't know what they were going to do. We were each allowed one suitcase, and we went to the old airport, and we stayed keeping low and keeping dark. We stayed quiet, and then loaded onto the plane. But it was a fairly, I remember when the plane took off, everyone started applauding because I think we were all filled with tremendous tension about what would even happen to us because the Army really was on a rampage here. Limited information we had suggested the world really did not know fully what was happening. And the Pakistan government, in some ways with the collusion of the U.S. government, were suppressing the news of what was happening. So we were all very keen, once we got to Karachi, to be able to tell the world of what exactly had happened here. We had great difficulty actually accessing phones and other communication. The embassy the U.S. embassy pretty much kept us out of contact with any kind of capacity to spread the information or news. We were in Karachi, I think 1 or 2 days, and then we flew on to Iran. When we were in Tehran, again, we were sent to a hotel, and we know that they had instructions from authorities, assumed would be Iranian, but maybe American as well, that those of us that were in that hotel weren't given access to phone our families and so forth in the United States. So they were trying to keep the news of what happened here away from the public media. We were back in Washington, D.C., and I was assigned to the NIH. But obviously, I didn't continue doing much medical work. I was really working on letting the news out about Bangladesh. So we created, first of all, an advocacy NGO called the Friends of Bangladesh, and we received donations both for running that, but also for contributing to now what was beginning to be a refugee flow into West Bengal. And then we began to work closely with congressional and senatorial groups that were interested in releasing the news. So we worked quite closely with Senator Church of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee and his executive director named Tom Dine. And then we worked quite closely with Ted Kennedy's subcommittee on the judiciary and his two assistants, Jerry Tinker and Dale DeHaan. But we set up a lobby group, and then we canvassed essentially the senatorial and the congressional staff. We also put the news out through the press as best that we could. We organized public protests on the steps of Congress in Massachusetts, Governor's Hall. There was also a boat flotilla trying to blockade a ship that we thought was taking arms to Pakistan. In the meantime, because I was a government employee, I was also trying to get news into the State Department, and also I can't remember when, but I eventually was called to testify by Senator Kennedy, and I went to the Judiciary Committee and testified of what I witnessed. I don't think any of us ever thought twice about how we should be allocating our priorities and time, because the genocide was that atrocious and it had not been publicly exposed and had not been stopped. So there was a real drive for all of us to be out on the campaign. One of the things that I'm proud of is that we were told that we were among the most effective advocacy lobby groups that Washington had witnessed up until then. And I think we were told part of the reason was that we were physicians who had witnessed the events and who were describing them as we saw them. And they compared us to the scientists who had the anti-nuclear campaigns in Washington, where the bearer of the message for the advocacy had more credibility in the American press and community. The most vivid part for me was that in the jockeying over whether I could go to the Congress for testimony, the NIH director tried to stop me from doing so, and I insisted on doing that. And then in a negotiated compromise, I met actually with the Deputy Secretary of State privately, and I think his name was Whitehead at that time, but I'm not sure. But I was able to recount what I saw and witnessed. I was naive enough to believe that that was a way of getting the information to the authorities and that something would happen. But I realized in retrospect that I was being managed. I'm not sure it was the Cold War as much as it was that Nixon and Kissinger were keen on the rapprochement with China, and Pakistan was the intermediary. And they just didn't want to have anything disturb what would be President Nixon's crowning foreign policy breakthrough, even genocide. I mean, that's I think the horrendous part of this, that people would allow genocide to go on for these kinds of political purposes. I think the public outrage increasingly grew palpable, and I think that it probably the Nixon-Kissinger repression of news and information, and about standing in the way of both initially relief, but then of independence for Bangladesh, could not be stopped. I think that the public opinion in the United States was just overwhelming over time. And actually, our friends of Bangladesh, I think we might have started off as friends of East Pakistan or East Bengal or something. Maybe we used the word East Bengal, I can't remember exactly. But at some point in that continuum, we changed to being friends of Bangladesh. So there was definitely a flow of attitudes and views about whether there could ever be any reconciliation. Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, it's 41 years, and to have all of these remembrances evoked and remembered, and all of the people that we were associated with. It was a wonderful time and a wonderful feeling for Bangladesh and its people that they were able to finally have an independent country.